Great. Hi everyone, so we're going to talk about analysis today. This is probably going to be quite a long workshop that I would advise you coming back and forth to. So analysis is a pretty crucial part of debating. It's probably the most integral part, and I'm going to run you through, I think, ways to understand what is expected of you when you're debating, in general actually, but how you would seek to fulfill this request upon you. Sounds very dire actually now I think about it. So, how is this workshop going to be useful to you? I think it's probably going to be useful to everybody, in the sense that I think analysis is so integral to debating that every person, well, apart from the top echelon of people, often will make mistakes in debating about making logical inconsistencies, and some of the stuff I'll talk about in this workshop will be developing the idea of how to understand where logical gaps come from, how to prevent them from happening within prep, but also just within your own speech. So if you're more new to debating though, if you find that you often lose debates because you get out-rebutted, so you have a team that's able to take you down quite easily by just saying that this stuff is not true and here are some reasons why. This suggests that you are doing analysis, but your analysis isn't as strong as you can make it. And even more generally, if you lose debates because you don't prove something, this workshop will definitely be useful to you. So an overview. So we're going to talk about burdens, what burdens are, how to conceptualize them. I'm going to then run through a checklist of things you want to think about when you're trying to run a case in order for you to not hard forth or just miss analysis, and therefore hard first, if such a thing exists. And I'm going to talk about maybe conceptually the difference between defensive and offensive analysis. So these are ways in which at least I conceptualize what analysis is in debating, and this may be somewhat useful to you. So let's talk about burdens. So what are a burden? So burdens is a term that we use in debating to describe an expectation placed upon an argument in order for judges to believe it is true and important. So independent of what you're saying in a debate, everything you say has certain burdens attached to it. These burdens are core questions that judges have and just any individual listening to you has in order for you to believe this is true. So this is reasoning that is essential for making the case being able to be bitten into and being able to successfully defeat your opponents. Let's take an example of what a burden is then. So let's say you have the motion this House would make voting compulsory, a pretty bogged down and pretty accessible motion. The first burden that comes to you, or the first question you probably are thinking when you think about what kind of arguments you could make to saying why voting ought to be compulsory, is you might say you want to make voting compulsory so that more people vote. Great. That might be your first argument, right? The first burden, or the main burden associated with that, is why is it the case that making it compulsory actually makes people vote? And more importantly, I imagine you don't just think voting is a priori good. There are arguments made to why voting in its just entirety is good, but conceptually you probably think voting is useful or instrumentally valuable for something. I.e., if you went to the ballot box and I made up 5 random people and I gave people a choice to tick, or cross should I say, cross any one of those 5 random boxes, and then I just shredded that piece of paper, they have voted, but it isn't a meaningful vote, right? So when you're trying to make an argument like you may be making, that you should make voting compulsory so that more people vote, there is something about the process of voting that is valuable, and something that forcing people to do it means it actually is valuable. So there are 2 burdens you've identified there by thinking about why, just thinking like a human being, let's say, about why you would agree with an argument that maybe someone's trying to convince you of. This gets into there must be, as I said, some aspect of voting that is meaningful. And then you get to, in prep, start to think about, well, is it the act of voting a priori? Is it voting for a specific political party? Is it voting in a way that actually meaningfully changes the world? As in, if I voted for the Labour Party, would you think it is a proper and genuine vote, even if the Labour Party never got elected? Now, there is no correct answer here, right? But in a debate and in these circumstances, thinking about burdens within itself can help you understand the expectations you may wish to place upon yourself when running an argument. You may wish to just run an argument that being able to vote is a priori good, or you may wish to seek to make arguments about voting being instrumentally useful, and therefore recognize what you need to prove is true, as in you need to prove that making voting compulsory makes people turn out to vote and vote in a way that is meaningful for them, or in a way that you think is meaningful generally, as in if more people voted, they'd be able to actualize their preferences because the right politicians would be elected, and then providing reason that gives you a groundwork and a framework to understand what reasons you have to give in order to make that true, i.e. in this instance, that if people are going to go, if voting is compulsory, people will make an active effort to learn who they should vote for because they're going to vote for it, and therefore they will end up learning about people more, and therefore better able to understand what policies ought to be used, etc. So burdens are the framework that allows you to get to that point, and by thinking of burdens, irrespective of the motion, you start to recognize what you need to prove when you're running an argument. So let's say you're in prep. How do you think about this in 15 minutes? So there are two ways to go about it, right? The first is to start with impacts and then lead to burdens. The other way is to think of clashes, I think. I say I think because I can't remember what the other thing is yet. I made this presentation a week ago. Anyway, let's think about impacts, right? So what is an impact? So an impact is an end point of a claim, or something that you think is changing in the world and is important. I.e. in the voting example, people exercising their vote is the impact you may wish to go for. This anchors your prep, right? Because now you and your partner know what you're trying to say is true, and trying to persuade people actually happens as a result of the motion. This means, therefore, you can work back and think of the ways in which you're going to prove that is true. So you'd ask two questions as a result, right? The first is, what do I need to actually prove to convince like a random stranger that this endpoint is actually likely to materialize from the motion? Because it is the first part of an argument to say this house would make voting compulsory because people would go out to exercise their vote. Unfortunately, that won't win you a debate because you need to convince the panel that the premise and the conclusion are linked by something that is plausible. I.e., if I do make voting compulsory, it actually will make people turn out to vote in a really meaningful way. As in, an opposition could stand up and go, well, they'll just spoil their ballots, or they'll just accept a fine, or it actually isn't a meaningful thing just to vote by putting an X on the paper or something else. Thinking about this has made you realize what has to be proven. Second is, as I said, what will your opponents contest? So after you recognize how you're going to link some reasoning to why something is an impact is likely to accrue by a motion, start to think about how opponents will try to unpick this. By doing this, you will understand where your opponents are likely to attack you, and going back to our diagnosis point, you will now understand or be able to preempt some reasoning that may come out of opposition. I.e., if you find that you are often losing debates because rebuttal lands from other teams, by thinking in this way, you will know what rebuttal you should be expecting, and ergo will know how to get around, at least will know what you have to get around. So that is the first step in order to preempt, right? It's not as hard as you think, because you may think, let's take an example here. If it's like this house to make voting compulsory, and you're like, okay, we would make voting compulsory because more people will turn out to vote, and this is a good thing because voting is instrumentally valuable for people because they get political representation. What are your opponents going to contest there? One, they may contest the plausibility of people coming out to vote in a meaningful way. Then you know you have to have a few reasons to why this is likely to happen, i.e. why people, when they're made to vote compulsory, will use it instrumentally valuably. A few reasons you could give are, states have a direct incentive, therefore, to educate their citizenry in ways that are positive to them, i.e. they will educate the citizenry on political issues such that they can accurately judge the government's prior action, such that they're more likely to continue voting for that government. They have a selfish incentive here. You continue this forever, to be honest with you, because then you may think, my opponents will respond to that prior argument by saying this undermines the legitimacy of that vote, because governments may educate their populace in ways that are maladaptive for the equality of representation. Here you can now recognize that teams may push a different burden upon you, i.e. they may say that your burden isn't just to prove that voting is meaningful, but that voting is accessible, as in it doesn't matter what party you come from or what party's in power, you are as likely to be able to actualize enough information of each voting party, irrespective of who's in power. This is the kind of process you want to be thinking about in prep when you recognize what impact you want to run, and this is what you should be spending the 15 minutes of prep thinking about from an analytical standpoint. thinking about analysis to prove your claim, but also insulating against responsiveness. I think this house would make voting compulsory is a very good example of a motion that is quite balanced and in some ways quite deep, because there are many, many attack angles. So you may wish to use this as a private drill for yourself to think about this stuff, even with your partner that you may be developing, a partnership you may be developing. Aha, boss clashes. So the second way you may want to think about this is maybe you don't naturally think about impacts, and some people don't. Maybe you want to think about clashes instead. So clashes is where you consider at the start of prep, and I think I have an introduction to prep video that I talk about this in a little bit more detail. You may wish to start by thinking, what are teams going to disagree about? So in this case, in the instance of voting compulsory, it may be one of them is actually what is a meaningful vote, as in what makes voting meaningful. You now know what the disagreement will be in the potential disagreement in the debate, and you may wish to use the framing that I talked about in a prior video to understand why that is the most important aspect of the debate. You then ask yourself two questions. The first is, why is this a disagreement? So what are we fundamentally disagreeing about when we think about voting or the value of voting? The point here is what is actually meaningful about voting is the question that comes from this questioning. This means you can understand what I actually have to convince the panel of, specifically relative to what your opponents are going to say, to make them agree that this clash ought to be won by my side. So my opponents are going to claim that something about the nature of compulsory voting undermines the core aspect of a vote. If I'm able to prove on Gov to the panel that voting is valuable even if it is somewhat coerced because of any reason. It could be because it means people actually are able to actualize their preferences. It means people get educated more. It means people are more politically engaged, which is principally or practically good. Or whatever. You've now recognized how to insulate yourself against one burden push of op and to push the metric of the debate in a way that is in your favor. By thinking about burdens in this way, you have therefore allowed yourself to, in prep, recognize what you need to prove in order to win. This is crucial for the earlier you are in the debate. So if you're opening government, this is more crucial than if you're closing opposition. But likewise, in closing opposition, you'll be wanting to think about this so that your extension speaker has preemptive analytical responses to key clashes that will come up. But I look at the extension video of Alexander. He's quite good, and we'll probably do look at that one. It's quite good. Great. So let's think about a different example here. So let's say we have this house would reintroduce hard labor in prisons. So this looks like manual labor, breaking rocks, building roads. If you've ever seen like an American movie in like the 60s or a hard Western movie, you probably know what I'm talking about. So let's think, if you think about impacts, so if you're approaching burdens in prep by impacts, let's think of the first question, right? What do I need to prove to convince a stranger that the endpoint is likely? So let's say the endpoint you wish to reach is deterrence. What you're going to have to think about in prep and produce reasons of is why the reintroduction of hard labor will actually have a deterrence effect. So maybe pause the video and think about some reasons. Oh shit, I didn't provide those reasons. Okay, sorry. So some reasons could be the fact that you have to prove that there is a tipping point to hard labor. So maybe you recognize that your opponents are going to contest the signaling of this, right? They're going to claim that, one, the reintroduction is insufficient because maybe people don't know about its reintroduction. This seems like a really simple thing not to miss, right? But you'd be surprised how many burdens people don't fulfill. It might be the case that opposition wins this debate by saying, you reintroduce hard labor, but people just don't recognize that as a punishment. You'd be surprised because most people maybe don't know what the punishment for cannabis use is, for instance. They know they'll go to jail, but if you're trying to, in this motion, change the severity of punishment rather than the actual amount of punishment, there is a very important burden upon Gov to argue why the level of punishment is important, but most importantly that people will recognize as a change of level and punishment. The motion gives fiat for policy change, but not that everybody in the world is now aware of this. So you're going to have to argue that the signaling effect is sufficient, that deterrent actually works, or maybe that there's something morality independent of this. So your opponents may argue that this is just morally wrong, and you might want to have preemption or why it is morally right that this form of punishment is acceptable in prisons. You may wish to use framing to your advantage here by contextualizing in what instances hard labor will or won't be used as a punishment. Like I imagine in juvenile prison, it's very unlikely in a democratic system or a system that has some degree of accountability of the judiciary that kids of like 16 are going to be made to build roads. Although maybe they are. Maybe you think that's a persuasive argument about, maybe it's character building, I don't know. Maybe it gives them skills or shit like that. Debating is such a curse sometimes. But this is what you want to be thinking about, right? So this is one example of how thinking about impacts can lead you to knowing the analysis that you need to prove, i.e. how do I convince the panel that my endpoint is likely within the lens of how my opponents are going to try to dissuade judges that such an impact can materialize. I think this is the way in which I think about prep, or at least I think about burdens in prep. If we think about clashes instead, so one clash, so the first question to ask yourself, sorry, I thought someone had broken into my house there. So the first clash is, what is fundamental to the disagreement here? Or what's going to be disagreed on, what's fundamental? Let's say one disagreement is crime levels and another is prisoner experience. So there may be a clash in the debate about how this actually changes the level of crime, particularly how it changes like things like the first time offending rates and how it changes re-offending rates. The second might be prisoner experiences, right? Maybe an argument on op is this is they agree that this is a more severe form of punishment, which is a burden to prove actually, because you may argue that they're actually maybe hard labor would replace likely things like what was that thing? We got locked in a room. Solitary confinement, right? That might actually be a very interesting curve. Anyway, modeling is something you can. We're going to have a motions breakdown series of videos. I'll talk about how to do these things. So kind of policy anyway. So this might be two clashes in the debate, right? So you might want to, next question you want to ask yourself is, how can I convince the panel relative to my opponents of my side? Let's take maybe the first clash here about crime levels. Maybe you're gonna have to argue that hard labor does, or if you're on op, doesn't actually affect prisoners or potential criminals. Maybe you argue that the causes of crime are independent from a deterrence effect, i.e. people are going to commit crimes regardless because maybe of material necessity, because of socialization. All you're now going to do is push people into worse forms of punishment, and that crucially that this worst form of punishment is bad. The key to this is that when you think about clashes and even impacts, every time you get to a new level of a claim, always ask yourself the question why. So when we go back to what I just said, I claim that the hard labor is more severe. Why? That people are more affected by socialization and deterrence. Why? That people are actually going to do crime independent of deterrence. Why? And that this doesn't affect reoffending rates because maybe you are inculcated in a culture. Why is this more important than why does this influence prisoners more than deterrence? These are constant questions in prep you should be asking yourself and your partner, especially if you think you have the case, because there's always going to be an analytical gap, even if you've recognized burdens and you've done some work to satisfy them. There's always more things you can do. There's always more whys you can ask. There's always more angles you can recognize are and could be exploited by your opponents in order to preempt them. So this is how you may think about burdens in prep. Let's think about burden satisfaction. So it's all well and good being able to identify the burden, but let's talk about how we're going to actually satisfy the burden. So first off, burdens, I think, an analysis in general in debating has three parts. The first is mechanization, second is tipping points, third is comparatives. Mechanization. There is a bridge analogy that Alistair uses that I am not going to use, but if you see Alistair in a competition, ask him about the bridge analogy because it may make sense to you. It doesn't make sense to me. Mechanisms are sets of independent reasons why a claim is plausible. The reason that mechanisms are important is, whilst it is sufficient to have one reason why an impact can plausibly happen from a motion, it is usually insufficient to win a debate because teams are likely to attack you on that reason. Therefore, you're wanting to produce a set of reasons that independently prove plausibility and that aren't dependent therefore on each other, meaning that teams have to attack each individual one to de-link the argument. Recognize that the bigger the impact, the more steps of analysis are required and the more mechanisms you require. Therefore, maybe each step will have fewer mechanisms. What you want to do here is, within prep and within burden identification, to recognize which pieces of your argument trail are likely to be the most vulnerable or the most contested, and really beef those up with as many good mechanisms as you can. It's also important to recognize that mechanization often cross-applies to different strands of an argument that we'll see in a second. Second is tipping points. So tipping points, and this is a very common thing that you'll hear in an OA, is that you might hear, no team achieved a tipping point, or you didn't achieve your tipping point in your argument. A tipping point is essentially showing why the motion as it is read and the motion as you have claimed is going to be performed in the world actually results in a change to the world that you claim it does. So what impacts are, as I said earlier, are just this motion changes something about the world. What your mechanization is attempting to do is to show that the world changes in a way. A part of analysis, which also takes in things like framing and characterization, is to show why your mechanism actually changes the world. So for instance, if it is, I will say in a second what I talked about here. Thirdly, let's talk about comparatives. There's going to be a whole video on comparatives later. There should be, I say later because I'm living in the present, not in the future when these videos are uploaded. But there will be an introduction to comparatives that will go into this in more detail. But comparatives are essential to debating because all teams are going to argue there's a tipping point of some kind. But very simply, Gov will be arguing that there is a positive tipping point. Op will be arguing that there is a bad form of tipping point. What you need to do within your mechanization and tipping point is to argue, one, why the tipping point you argue is mutually exclusive, why the change that you think happens to the world can only happen by this motion and not by anything else. This stops Op from standing up and saying, you claim that this motion stops reoffending rates. This can also happen on our side, particularly in a This House would motion where governments can counterprop, but also when potentially opposition can point to trends that exist in status quo, or the fact that your reasoning is delinked from the motion and can exist by other mechanisms in status quo. For instance, if you're talking about reoffending rates, you may argue one mechanism to why hard labour may be successful is you may claim that this would be a weird argument. You may claim that hard labour means that police forces become far more brutal in their identification of criminals, and this means that criminality decreases. Op may argue that there is already things that exist in status quo that are coming on the horizon that will make police more brutal, i.e. maybe it is plausible that police are currently in internal investigations that will conclude with them having reformation that will make them more severe, whatever. This is not a very good argument if you make it, but this is hopefully elucidating the fact that sometimes opposition teams will try to co-opt your mechanization to delink it from the motion to try to claim that your tipping point isn't actually a tipping point. So you want to be very clear about why what you claim is going to change in the world can only change on your side and will only change on your side. So let's give an example here. Let's go back to the example of This House would make voting compulsory. Let's say your argument is we should do this because it makes people more enfranchised. Here are your mechanisms you may use. All people will vote. This seems simple, but this is a mechanism. This is an independent reason to why people will be enfranchised, because all people will now vote per the view of the motion. Second, you may model in that there are going to be fines that actively incentivize people to turn up to the ballot. So whilst all people are presumably mandated to vote, people will now be directly also incentivized to vote because of a punishment that they want to avoid. Obviously, you can recognize that teams may try to claim that the fines are insufficient, and therefore you can probably have auxiliary mechanisms to why the fines will be a sufficient motivation to not just get people out to vote, but to get to the people that you want to come out to vote, and in sufficient numbers for them to do what you want them to do. You may then claim that large voter blocks will be formed as a result of your two prior mechanisms, although you can see now there's a dependency formed, which often can naturally happen and should happen. There should be a logical flow of your argument. You may claim that the larger voter block creates swing voters. That means that disenfranchised groups can actually become part of the swing voter, and maybe this is a way in which you actualize democratic representation. So these are two independent mechanisms and a very good linked mechanism that shows a tipping point. You may be trying to prove that political parties are therefore actively moving to favor voter engagement rather than voter-specific disenfranchisement, right? When all voters can vote, it means political parties have to engage with people that they would otherwise have disenfranchised in status quo because they know they will vote for somebody and they want them to vote for them. This is where you want to maybe impact the hell out of this by saying why this is a uniquely beneficial and most important aspect of the debate, i.e. disenfranchise people from the thing that this motion is trying to solve. It's often good in motions to identify a problem and make analysis work around that problem and how it solves. The comparative here, and this is something you might be able to explicitly flag, is that maybe without compulsory voting, the path of least resistance for political parties is to disenfranchise rather than convert, because maybe it's easier in terms of energy to prevent a voter from making a voter feel apathetic or physically restraining a voter from being able to vote, as opposed to trying to convince them that they should vote for the Republicans and the Democrats as opposed to the Democrats and the Republicans. So this is an example of what mechanization, tipping points, and comparative means, and how they all flow together to hopefully construct a case that is persuasive. Great, so hopefully we know a little bit about, hopefully this has clarified, at least introduced and clarified some aspects of analysis in a very regimental, but I think hopefully useful way when you're approaching a debating. So the checklist you want to do is when you're in prep, you want to know what your burdens are. You want to agree with your partner what is expected of you if you're going to run argument X or argument X, Y, and Z. You want to be very clear, both within your partnership as well as within your speech, what the tipping points are, i.e. flag to a judge what you're trying to prove, what you're trying to claim changes in the world, because as soon as judges know that, you've done half the battle, right? Now all you need to do is to satisfy this. If you do, then you're on the way to the races, because if you're able to analyze this successfully, or let's say, if you're able to analyze this and to be honest with you, analysis is quite natural, right? Proving likelihood is quite easy for people to do when they know what they need to prove, because there's loads of bullshit reasons that come into your head, and it will the more you experience it. And the third thing is comparative. Recognize there are teams in the debate that are trying to probably co-opt you and trying to beat you. Be charitable to them, as in they are going to argue. There probably are changes that happen on both sides of the house. You need to be clear by the change, why the change you're talking about only happens on your side of the house, and importantly within your analysis, but which we'll talk about more in the comparatives video, making your analysis uniquely important to your side of the house. Great. So this is the analysis checklist. So I'm going to finish off by going a little bit deeper and potentially evaluating different forms of analysis. So I think there's many different ways you can group analysis, but I think there's two ways that I like to think about it. First is the defensive, and the second is offensive use of analysis. So let's talk about defensive use of analysis. So what do I mean by defensive analysis? So a defensive analysis is essentially what you maybe would consider conventional analysis. This is reasons to why you think something is true is actually true. So this involves burden satisfaction, proving a tipping point. Additionally, this demonstrates mutual exclusivity, right? With your analysis, you want to be proving that what happens on your side can only happen on your side, and that it's likely to happen on your side. These are the questions you're going to ask yourself during prep. Is that when you think of reasons to when you think of reasons to why an impact is true, think yourself if you actually think these are true. You might be like, if a random guy in the pub was trying to convince you of the thing you're going to try to convince the judges of, and they gave you your reasons, would you go, yeah, probably, or would you go, that's bullshit? If you go, that's bullshit, good, you've recognized that your analysis is very strong. Think about some other reasons. If you can't, then be better, right? I guess. It comes with experience. The second thing with defensive analysis is not just satisfying burdens, so proving why there is a tipping point and why there's mutual exclusivity and impacts are likely, but showing why your case is insulated against responsive material. What you want to be doing here is providing things like preemption, maybe specifically flagging to judges rather, my opponents are going to try to attack my argument by saying this. Here's why that's not true. As in, they might say, in the voting example, they may claim that actually, if you're talking about the impact of enfranchised voters, they may claim that, oh, apathy is still going to be likely because people don't like the system they're in and won't be enfranchised in the system because their vote doesn't actually change things. Here are 5 reasons why that is wrong, and the voters will actually likely have some degree of tipping point. 1, there is positive signaling. 2, they're involved in the community, which means they get some surface level impact as a result of actively voting. 3, they actually do result in a change because you're likely to aggregate minority voting blocks. 4, it's likely to at least change local elections in ways in which people are enfranchised into power. 5, the act of voting and education may lead people to actually believe as if they can have a difference because they go to like community meetings, they scrutinize politicians more because they wish to be more informed. Even if this doesn't affect everybody, it affects a few numbers of individuals, this is still an impact in terms of people being enfranchised, right? So this is, like, off the top of my head, ways in which you start thinking about case insulation. You may also wish to produce red herrings, right? You might want to be a bit devious and provide reasons that seem stupid so that people attack them, so that they're avoiding the reasons that are important. This is probably, I mean, my only caution here is that maybe some judges won't recognize what is important, but if they don't recognize what's important and they fall for the red herring, you're probably going to lose anyway. So an example of this might be being flippant with one piece of analysis, as in saying, you know, this isn't the best argument in the world, but then like that, and then say the argument. And then throughout your speech have like 5 or 6 pretty sophisticated arguments, because teams often will just smell weakness and attack one argument but not the 5. This can happen quite a lot, actually. It can be some. I see this more actually in our prep session, in our training at St Andrews, than I do competitions, but it is actually something that maybe you want to try. You also want to have multi-level burdens, right? What I mean by this is, when you consider a case installation and considering how people respond to you, take them both in good and bad faith. So in bad faith, argue by saying this response just is shit, as in when they say this, it won't work for these reasons. But then also recognize that teams may and probably will persuade the judges of some degree of mitigation of your case. So have some reasoning there in your case to why, even if you, like panel, even if you hear a very good response to this case, we still have this material, and it still doesn't matter because even a mitigated version of this argument is preferable. I did this naturally when I just talked there, right? In that example, I said, even if we don't get all people enfranchised into the system, you just get more people franchised, right? So this is a multi-level burden, because I'm like, okay, I have tried to prove to you that a lot of people become franchised, but I'm willing to accept the trade-off that even if few people get enfranchised, they do so in a meaningful way. So this is an example of multi-level burdening, and a way of insulating your case against good responsiveness, but imprecise responsiveness. And I think these are 2 things that will mean that you don't fall prey to, 1, judges claiming you're not proving your arguments, but 2, avoiding the very simple flippant rebuttal actually working against your case. Great. So let's look at a specific example here, right? God, I've used this motion 3 times now. So if we have the motion, this House believes states should abandon anti-terrorism decapitation strategies, i.e. just going after a leader rather than other kinds of policies. What is a burden here? One burden might be, one obvious burden that I think many actual op teams miss, is that you may wish to argue that the decapitation strategy actually works, and this is why you shouldn't abandon it. This may seem very trivial. I have seen very good debaters miss this. How do you satisfy this? Here are some reasons, right? You might be like, well, there's power leverage that exists between people who commit anti-terrorism and the terrorists. Like the US has a massive amount of capacity of surveillance, geopolitical maneuvering, and just military money shit. That means they will get to the leaders because they can trace them with tech, tech and drones and shit. They have like things like spies. Like there are people within the country that will rat out the leader. You have betrayers within the organization that will rat out a leader because of, 1, their own security, because it's a way in which they can get back to the US without being in jail. Maybe they don't want to be terrorists anymore. Or secondly, you have the second in command that wants to be the first in command. And the only way to do that is to betray the first in command. Or geopolitical leverage, i.e. they can utilize the state's apparatus within a particular terrorist country like Pakistan for... The US can do this for beneficial means, even though they didn't really, did they? Because bin Laden was away for a long time. So this is an example of how you would go and satisfy this burden. Thinking of 3 independent reasons, or even I think there's 6 there. 6 independent reasons to why it's likely that decapitation strategies work. And then you go to insulation, right? Think about you think about how op would respond, Gov would respond. Gov might respond that, let's do best case insulation here. So even if Gov was able to convince the panel that all of those reasons were wrong, that these are insufficient to make decapitation work, you may recognize you want to take a lower burden in the case. I don't actually know if it's a low or high burden. Now I think about it, it's a different burden. Let's say you might claim, okay, maybe this strategy won't be necessarily successful in killing the leader, but maybe it has a signaling effect, right? Maybe terrorist organizations know terrorist leaders know they're going to be attacked. So even if they aren't killed and aren't attacked, this is still beneficial because maybe it changes their behavior in ways that are important. Maybe it changes the types of intimidation they do. Maybe it makes them more reticent to do terrorist attacks, etc., etc. This is a way in which you're accepting a multi-burden that we're talking about by recognizing what op will attack and taking the best case of op's rebuttal. So if op does take out that part of your burden satisfaction argumentation, showing the judges why you're still winning, even if this is true. Essentially, this just increases the number of things op needs to attack. This is what the element and the conclusion of defensive analysis is. Hopefully this is clear. Good. Let's talk about offensive analysis. So this is where we start to enter into aspects of rebuttal, and I would advise you to go to the Introduction of Rebuttal workshop by Path, which does one of the most concise of the SSDC videos so far. Does a very good job of understanding the basic elements of responsive material. This would be a little bit probably more long-winded. I was going to say more detailed, but it's probably just being long-winded. Anyway, what is offensive analysis? First is mitigation, right? When you're trying to undermine the plausibility of an argument, all you're doing is providing reasons why something isn't true, but using it not to prove something yourself, but to undermine a claim from another person. I.e., if you're op in the previous motion and you're trying to undermine the plausibility that these strategies will work, you're going to actually be providing reasons why power leverage won't work, why Pakistan, for instance, has its own direct incentives, why there isn't sufficient power leverage because maybe you have a massive drone, but individuals or terrorists are able to hide underground and are able to use VPNs, NordVPN. Hopefully we get sponsored one day, actually. That was going to be a long time before we have any sponsorships on this channel, I guarantee you. Anyway, that kind of shit, right? So providing reasons that are offensive by showing why something that a gov or an op team may argue are unlikely to be true. Yeah, I've just said the same argument twice. The second thing you want to do with offensive analysis is not just to undermine the plausibility of a claim, but to try to flip the claim. So beyond mitigation, you want to argue maybe why your opponent's arguments, even if they're true, are actually bad. So for instance, even if you obviously want to levy some mitigation against the claim that decapitation strategies are successful, especially because some OO teams may not actually prove this, and it's a good way to beat them. But it at least can stand as an independent contribution that they can weigh, especially if you want to turf burn your closing for having a unique responsive angle. Beyond that, you might want to just take them at their best, right? Say, okay, even if this decapitation strategy works, the fact it works is bad for some reason. You may wish to think about a moral case here about why it's immoral for governments in the anti-terrorism strategy to kill people. Maybe you think that actually by killing the leader, terrorist organizations will do more terrorism because you don't have a leader that keeps ideological fractions together. You have a power vacuum which causes a splintering of terrorist organizations, which, because they are smaller and now underground, are far harder to get to and stop, essentially. So this is essentially best case weighing here. You're providing analysis to why, even if an argument is true, it is likely to result in something that is bad. The likely to result to in this way you use your offensive analysis to show why it is likely to be a bad thing. And this in itself can be this is essentially the basis of a rebuttal extension, right? I think a rebuttal extension is often, okay, I think people call mitigation attempts a rebuttal extension, but that isn't necessarily what a rebuttal extension is. I think if you watch Alexander's extension video, which I advise you to do, this because it's a good job of explaining this, rebuttal extensions, you can find a whole 40 minutes to talk about offensive analysis to why something is unlikely to be true, but also is actually a bad thing to do with analysis. And this is essentially a core rebuttal extension. So you might wish to do offensive analysis. This way, this is something you definitely want to do as a member of opposition, a member speech, so extension speech, against your diagonal. Obviously, this type of offensive analysis is ways of delinking the analysis that you claim from the claim that other teams are making, stealing this analysis and demonstrating inverse impact. So here's an example, right? So let's say we go back to this motion. This house believes that states should abandon anti-terrorism decapitation strategies. Let's talk about some mitigation examples. So as I talked about, there might be the successfulness of the strategy, right? You might be arguing that terrorist organizations are sufficiently adaptable that even if you remove their leader, they're still able to do terrorism, they're still able to intimidate, they're still able to function. You have to provide reasons why this is likely. Maybe the core element of terrorism that is bad is just the killing of people, and you don't need to have organization, even if that's what leaders provide in order to do this. This may be a type of mitigatory response to the idea of successfulness. This is probably a type of lethal response now that I think about it. You may argue subterfuge, for instance, that this strategy is unlikely to be successful because you just can't get to the leader in the first place because they're very well hidden. This is a mitigatory push to show why it's very unlikely or likely to find the leader. This isn't damning because there's still a plausibility that they will find the leader, but this is the first step of offensive analysis. We argue traitors as well. Maybe they'll be traitors within your own anti-terrorist organization that that rat out the fact that the leader is about to be attacked, for instance. And you could argue why there would be an incentive and capacity for traitors within anti-terrorist organizations, just like a op team may argue that there would be traitors within a terrorist organization themselves. Let's talk about flipping. So flipping is the rebuttal you see less often, but it's something that with good analytical skills and good prep, you will definitely naturally do. So this is where you make the strategy, you claim on, if this is gov, right? Let's just say that op is true, that anti-decapitation strategies actually work. and then just show why it makes terrorism worse. This is class a Platonic extension, because it essentially takes the best case of a team and makes your life easy, because you can spend 7 minutes going, I agree with you, bro, but this is why it's actually really a bad thing for you to do. So things like splintering, maybe it causes them to be more extremist because now you have a verification of an enemy. Maybe the decapitation, if successful, kills the leader, just galvanizes everybody in the terrorist organization going, those infidels deserve to die even more. Maybe it causes retaliatory attacks on citizens. Maybe it causes more extreme behavior insofar there is a spectrum of terrorism. There are some terrorist organizations that maybe are freedom fighters in some perspectives and do certain moral considerations, but as soon as you attack their leader in this very visceral and public way, potentially, they may become more violent. I don't know whether this is true. Could be true in debate land. This is an example of how you can use offensive analysis in this type of motion for mitigation and flipping. Let's talk about, okay, summary. I said talk about as if I had more stuff to talk about, but I probably need to go and do my PhD, to be honest with you. So summary. So analysis is just simply reasons why there is a change in a debate, and that change only affects your one side. This encompasses things like burdens. This is the first thing you want to think about in prep when you're trying to discover the analysis you need, i.e. asking yourself, how would I convince a stranger that my impact that I'm trying to argue is true and my change is true, and why my opponents are going to be unable to convince the judge counter, i.e. what are my opponents going to argue and how do I seek to disprove that. Analysis can be used in two ways. The first is defensively to prove burdens and insulate your argument. Alternatively and successfully can be used offensively to make rebuttal very effective and to flip claims from best case of your opponents, which is like, if you can do that, easy, very clear way to win, and it's actually just how probably you win from closing most of the time. So that's all I have to say about analysis. Hopefully this is clear. Hopefully this has helped people who are new and maybe people who are a little bit more experienced. If anything is unclear, feel free to comment in the comment section, and I will be glad to answer clarifications or approach me on Messenger if you're that kind of person. Enjoy whatever you're doing. Hope you have a good day.